Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joe Corso from Long Beach Organic, and this is LBO Cooks. We have some guests today. We have Ann Barnes and her son Austin, our cameraman, who's also my intern. And we have another intern, Kira, and her husband, Steve. This isn't the usual crowd we have for our cooking lessons, but you know, COVID, so we're making do. And today we're going to cook Swiss chard recipes. Now Swiss chard, it's a beautiful plant. It's easy to grow. It's extremely prolific. Gardeners grow tons of it. But what do you do with it? I mean, it's not the easiest vegetable to know what to do with, and there's so much of it. So that's why I wanted to do a class on Swiss chard, because it's in season right now. This is February, and it's in season most of the year, in fact. So we're going to do 4 recipes today that are just a little bit above and beyond what you might normally do. Normally people throw it in a pan with a little olive oil or garlic, or they just steam it, and that's fine, but it could be better. So for starters, it's important to understand that the entire vegetable is edible, the stems and the leaves. However, they're different from each other. The leaves are like one vegetable and the stems are like another. So I'm going to separate them. So the recipes we're doing today all involve blanching the chard first, which means you're going to boil it really quickly, really fast, and drain it, and then put it in ice water, or you could, if we had a sink, we could run it under cold water. What that does is cooks it really quickly and then sets the color by chilling it down. And it also takes the edge off, because this is kind of a harsh taste. So I have boiling salted water here, and all we're going to do is dump our greens in there. They were washed earlier, but if you just wash them, you want to shake them dry so they don't add too much water to the pot. Really, we're only going to cook these until they're limp. It's already coming back to the boil. So you see these are going rather limp, rather fast. Don't worry, they're still going to be good. You're allowed to cook your vegetables. You know, some people are so worried about overcooking that they undercook them, but chard is very sturdy. So I have a bowl of ice water here. Drain the chard. That only took a few minutes. Doing this because you can keep doing it. And by the way, save the water, taste it when you're done. If it tastes okay, it makes a nice vegetable stock.
So the consistency that we're going for here is not wilted, just limp a little bit.
Yeah, not completely soft. So here we are, blanching, shocking, and you're going to squeeze out as much water as possible. Wrap it in a towel, squeeze again. It's nice to be outdoors and you can do this right on the ground. So this little green wad is all those leaves now blanched. We're going to chop it up.
Ooh, what a nice crunch.
And we are ready to go. Now we're going to cook the stems now, but they're just a little different. We're going to cut them on the bias. We're going to toss them in that cauldron here. Those are going to cook much longer, so we're going to cook those until they're tender. I have some heavy whipping cream. So I put a cup of cream in a saucepan. It's going to reduce. It's going to take a little while. So I have a dry pan here, nothing in it, on heat. And now these are the blanched chard stems. I'm throwing it in there. Because even though I did all that draining and squeezing, we want the cream to soak in, so that's why we want to dry out the vegetable first. Now I'll add those chopped greens. And by the way, this is so easy to do. Everyone thinks it's so impressive to do this. Try it at home with some dried beans. It's so much easier than trying to find your spoon. So that's starting to sort of stick, so that tells me that it's pretty well dried out now. And we have our reduced cream. And here we go. You may not need it all.
So when you say you don't need it all, what kind of consistency are we going for in terms of the cream? Just coating it nicely?
Yeah, it's hard. It has to just be less volume. It's still liquid because it's hot, so it's a little hard to gauge. But you want it to
Oh, how beautiful.
absorb into the chard. So I'm going to season it with a little fresh nutmeg and some salt and pepper.
Oh, it smells so delicious.
It does. It smells
That
great.
nutmeg is wonderful. Serve that up for you.
What do you think about it?
Delicious, very light,
Delicious?
still crispy, very fresh.
Let's see what it looks like.
Always looking for extra vegetables to cook, and I found my new recipe.
This is wonderful. Super light, very creamy. It almost reminds me of like an Alfredo, but with vegetables, and it's incredible.
Cheesy without that heaviness to it.
All right, so our next recipe is a chard omelet, and this is an omelet from the south of France, somewhere between a crepe and an omelet. It's really got more. It's going to have more chard in it than eggs, and it's usually served as kind of an hors d'oeuvre. So, composting the eggshells. So we'll beat our eggs, add a little salt and pepper. Beat that mixture together nicely and set it aside. Now we have our chard leaves that we've previously blanched. We'll chop those up. Give it a rough chop, doesn't have to be too fine. And now the garlic. I'm using 6 cloves of garlic here. You could use more, you could use less. You want to chop it up nicely. A little pinch of salt helps speed that along. And then we have all the components ready. Now we'll heat up a non-stick skillet, add a little olive oil. Let's add our garlic first. The garlic burns really easily. You don't want it to turn brown. Just cook it for a minute or so till it's fragrant. Add your Swiss chard leaves, stir them around, and we'll add that mixture into the eggs. And now that that's nicely mixed, we put a little more oil in the pan and put the egg mixture back. Spread it out with your fork. Cook it till it's nice and brown on the underside. We're going to flip it out and slide it back in to cook the other side. And that's all there is to it. Unmold it, fix it up if it falls over, slice it into wedges, and you have a wonderful appetizer. Swiss chard omelet, Crespo de Blette. The last recipe only used the leaves of the chard. This recipe only uses the stems. So these are the stems that have been piling up all day while I blanched leaves. And you know, they make good compost. You don't have to feel guilty about not using them, because they do require some serious cooking. But this is a really delicious way to do them. So I'm preparing them by, first of all, see if this can get this. Get as much of the stringy exterior off as you can. If you've ever gotten the strings off celery, it's the same sort of thing. And trimming off the green bits. This recipe is going to cook very, very long. So we've trimmed up these stalks, and now I'm trying to cut them into sticks roughly the same size. So I'll trim off that pointed end and cut the rest of the stalk in half. And work quickly, because like avocados or artichokes or some other vegetables, they darken. Put them in a saucepan. I'm going to squeeze in some lemon juice. That'll help keep them from turning dark. And sprinkle some salt. Toss that around. And I'm going to add just a dribble of water, just to film the bottom of the pan and get the cooking started. And that's going to cook. Put it on your slowest burner. You could even put it in a 300-degree oven to cook very slowly. It's called braising. We just want them to cook, take their own time, cook really thoroughly, and unlike boiling them in the water like we did for the first recipe, this will concentrate the flavor. None of the liquid is going to be lost. Okay, so while that's braising, I'm going to start on the sauce. So while the charred ribs are braising, we're going to make a sauce. This is just a very simple white sauce called bechamel. Sounds fancy, but it's not. That's 2.5 tablespoons of butter melted. I'm going to add flour. That's 3.5 tablespoons. More or less flour just makes it thicker or thinner. And you want to cook the flour and butter together for a couple of minutes. The idea is to really cook the flour so that the grains are separate and smooth. That way you won't get a lumpy sauce when you add liquid to it. So we're going to stir this around. You don't want it to brown. And now we're going to add some milk. I have 2 cups of milk, and I'm going to add it a little at a time to the hot roux. What will happen is it starts to form a paste. And when it's thick like that, when it's a thick paste with just a little milk, it's much easier to beat out any possible lumps. So let me add just a little bit more. And I'm going to switch to my whisk here. If you don't have a whisk, just keep stirring with the spoon, but the whisk is a little more efficient. And you see, this looks like mashed potatoes. But what we're doing is beating this mixture so that it won't have any lumps in it later. And we will now add the rest of the milk and whisk it till it's smooth. Just be patient, a little at a time. If you've ever made country gravy, this is pretty much the same thing. It's nothing, nothing too exotic. That's coming out nice and smooth. Add the final amount of milk. Keep whisking. All right, this sauce has come to a boil and it's thickened. Kind of never gets old, you know. I just love how it does that. It comes to a simmer, it thickens up really nice. It's nice and smooth. We're just going to cook it a couple minutes more to be sure that the flour is cooked, because you don't want to taste flour. So we're going to season that with some salt, some pepper, nutmeg again, old cookbooks say a few grains of nutmeg or a suggestion of nutmeg. It's like you don't want to taste it or anything, and I'm thinking, why not? A little bit of dried thyme. You could use fresh, but I forgot to pick some yesterday, so we're using dried. A little Dijon mustard. Start with maybe half a tablespoon. You don't want to overpower the taste of the chard, but the mustard does add a nice little note. 1 clove of garlic. This isn't a recipe where the more garlic the better. This is, you just want it subtle. All right, so the pan has changed magically, but we now have our braised chard ribs. They're very, very tender. They melt in your mouth. The liquid is reduced to just a syrup. All the flavor is concentrated. And we're now going to fold in some of our mustard garlic bechamel sauce. Now you probably won't have to use it all, but don't worry, this is good on all kinds. It doesn't have to be Swiss chard. Broccoli's good this way. Almost any green vegetable. We want it to be liquid but not soupy. Add a little more. Just happen to have some grated Swiss cheese. I'm using Swiss cheese, Gruyere cheese, because this is kind of a French recipe, but you could use any kind of cheese. I think cheddar cheese would be great with these colored chard stems, and Parmesan would be good. Jack cheese, whatever. It's only half a cup of cheese. We want the chard to be featured, but the cheese does add. And now I'm going to pour the whole thing into a buttered baking dish. So we're going to put the rest of the cheese on top. And you could put breadcrumbs too, or just breadcrumbs and no cheese.
Oh, that looks delicious.
And now I'm going to take this inside and put it in a hot oven, 425 degrees, for about 20 minutes. I'll be right back. Now we have our chard ribs gratin, nice and brown and bubbly. We had to put the broiler on for a minute there because it was all cooked and it still wasn't quite brown. That's fine. You just do what's necessary.
It looks so gourmet. Wow. Impressive.
All right, so our last recipe is a garbanzo bean stew with Swiss chard. I just soaked overnight and boiled a cup of dried chickpeas. And I'm going to drain them. And one of the real advantages for cooking any kind of beans dry is the wonderful broth you get.
Yes.
The stuff in the cans is kind of slimy and not so great. It's really nice, but 2 cans of chickpeas otherwise. Now I'm going to take those chickpeas, garbanzo beans, the same thing. Pois chiche in French. I'm going to put them in a baking dish and we're going to roast them with flavorings. I've got a couple bay leaves from the garden. We're going to do 10 whole cloves of garlic. Nothing subtle about this recipe. Peeled garlic cloves, a little salt, a little pepper, a teaspoon of fennel seed. That's at least a teaspoon. I love fennel. Chop up half an onion. And now we're going to douse this in olive oil. Over a cup of it. However, when we're all said and done, we're going to have this oil left over and it's going to be flavored with fennel and garlic and you could use it for any number of things. So none of it gets wasted. Cover that with foil. That is going to roast about 45 minutes. So I did some earlier today. Drain this oil. Beans, we have this oil. Broth from the beans. If you use canned beans, you could use vegetable stock. You could even use the liquid you boiled the chard leaves in earlier. 6 cloves of garlic. The pinch of salt to kind of make them stick together a little bit. This is a dish that I've made at so many LBO fundraisers. It's the vegan alternative to whatever we're serving. And the thing is, it's so tasty that the vegans never get any because it's all gone by the time they make their way to the buffet, because everybody loves it. We also need some chopped onion. Half an onion. You just peel it. And if you have contact lenses, wear them because you don't cry when you chop onions. So I'm going to cut it horizontally once, vertically a few times, and crossways, and it just becomes diced onion. So we have our oil, we have our broth, we have our beans, we have our garlic, we have our onions, and I also have Swiss chard leaves that I blanched and chopped earlier. Now, whenever I cook onions and garlic, no matter what the recipe says, I cook the onions first together. We're going to start with some of that wonderful oil. I don't want to burn the garlic. So I'm going to get those onions get nice and tender. It's going to take a few minutes. And again, we don't want it to burn, so we're just heat it up to the point of fragrance. Takes about a minute. We'll now add the chopped garlic, and we want that to cook through, form through. And now our Swiss chard, leaves only. The stems really wouldn't add much to this dish, I don't believe. The leaves will separate as it absorbs the oil. Alright, so those onions are cooked through. They even got a little brown, but that's fine. And the moisture's evaporating out of there. Now we'll take the bay leaves out of our beans, because they can get a little bitter. Some of that broth, you can use vegetable stock, full of fresh bay leaves. Really hearty, really colorful. It smells great. I'm gonna add a little more liquid. It's kind of by eye. This can all be put together the day before, a couple days before.
Okay.
I usually do this in the garden. Once it's all done, it's a bit of work, a lot of steps, but once it's all prepared, it's a pretty quick dish to throw together. Chickpea stew with garlic, fennel, and Swiss chard. It's been a great afternoon with doing these chard recipes. Now we're going to relax a little. Glass of rosé on a sunny February day in California. Couldn't be nicer. Bon appetit!